There are two big ways that a team can help themselves via the NFL draft. Number one is by their utilization of those picks in the draft itself to find players that fit their scheme, guys that they can develop, guys that can become big time contributors and stars. The other way is to take that draft pick currency and use it to improve your team, via trade and using those picks to acquire veteran pieces that will fit and help you right away. One team that has done a good job of that is the Seattle Seahawks. I always point back to the Marshawn Lynch deal, where they gave up a couple of late round picks in order to get a guy like a Marshawn Lynch. Now, on the flip side, they had done this also in the trade for Percy Harvin, which didn't exactly work out so well, except for Super Bowl 48, obviously. So when you look at the Seattle Seahawks draft and you look at a team that didn't necessarily have a ton of needs, they were able to sit there and put themselves in a position where they could use their draft pick currency to improve their team via the trade market, which is what they felt they did by sending a first round pick in Max Unger to the Saints for tight end Jimmy Graham and a fourth round pick. You know, when you look at the Seattle Seahawks, there's no question that the biggest need that they had on their team was on the offensive side of the ball, and it was a playmaker for Russell Wilson. They just didn't have any playmakers in the passing game, period. So when you look at the grand scheme of things, it makes a lot of sense that they would sit there and trade for somebody like a Jimmy Graham. Not the greatest blocker in the world and all of that, which will be interesting to see how he fits in that Seattle run-first scheme. But at the end of the day, you didn't bring in Jimmy Graham to run block. And that shouldn't be the biggest concern in the world. You brought him in to be a big-time weapon in that passing game for Russell Wilson, in particular in the red zone, an area where the Seattle Seahawks passing game really has struggled over the past couple of years. So when grading the Seattle Seahawks draft, we have to factor in that trade into the equation, and the fact that they took the 31st overall pick in Max Unger and turned it into a fourth round pick in Jimmy Graham. A good value, a good deal for the Seattle Seahawks based off of the current situation. This is a team that, is in a position to contend right away, could still contend for a while. They've got a lot of their core pieces, sans Russell Wilson, locked up under long-term deals. This is a team that needs impact. This is a team that doesn't need a lot, but what they need somebody that can make a big difference. So Jimmy Graham made a lot of sense for them and really helps when you look at the grand scheme of things in terms of the Seattle Seahawks draft. Now, in terms of the drafts, if they didn't have that first round pick, you weren't going to hear a lot of noise on draft weekend from the Seahawks, and I don't think you really did. The biggest noise that maybe came out of the Seahawks draft is the fact that they took a guy like Frank Clark out of Michigan in the second round, a guy with a domestic violence history. There was a lot of controversy in the aftermath of that draft in terms of the Seahawks taking this guy, especially based off of the current NFL climate today when it comes to domestic abuse situations. Also, the fact of whether or not John Schneider and that Seattle Seahawks front office did a proper job of vetting Frank Clark in this situation before they made the selection in the second round. And then on top of that, you look at Frank Clark, and in some ways you wonder why he was a second-round pick. Was he a second-round pick even based off of talent alone? I really don't think so. And then when you throw in the off-the-field baggage, there were probably multiple teams, many teams, maybe even a majority of teams that perhaps had Frank Clark rated as nothing more than a seventh-round pick or an undrafted free agent or somebody that was completely off of their draft board entirely because of that situation. So it was really interesting that the Seattle Seahawks took Frank Clark in the second round. Now, with that said, the Seahawks have never really been concerned with what other people think about the guys they take and where they take them. And that's been a formula to their success over the years. You remember way back in 2010 when they took Earl Thomas with the 14th pick, a lot of people were stunned and questioning the move because they didn't take Taylor Mays out of USC because he had familiarity with Pete Carroll. Taking Bruce Irvin in the first round in 2012, a move that I highly questioned at the time. This is a team that has a history of making some of these picks, and then they end up really panning out for them, and perhaps Frank Clark does. I have to say, though, to me, the best pick that the Seahawks made in terms of the draft selections they did make, beyond question, was Tyler Lockett, the wide receiver and return specialist from Kansas State. Here's a guy to me that has some elements to his game of, let's say, a Randall Cobb, and sometimes I watched him and I thought he maybe even reminded me from a route running basis of an Antonio Brown. Here's a guy that can get open. Here's a guy that has some elusiveness. Here's a guy with some speed. Here's a guy, to me, that could step in and almost instantly be the #1 option at wide receiver for Russell Wilson in the passing game. Now you take the fact that you brought in Jimmy Graham, you throw in a Tyler Lockett, and the situation looks a lot better for Russell Wilson in that Seahawks offense in terms of getting more explosive big plays and more consistent movement of the ball down the field in the passing game in 2015. I love the pick of Tyler Lockett. Yes, they moved up to get him, and they gave up quite a bit to get him. But again, it's not so bad for the Seahawks to give up multiple picks to move up to get a guy like Tyler Lockett because they don't need a ton. They just don't need a ton. Again, as I emphasized, you're looking for those few players that can come in and make a big immediate impact, and I think a guy like Tyler Lockett can do that in multiple facets of the game. But there are other picks in this draft that I really like for them too. A couple of other guys that I think could stand out in terms of their potential to contribute would be Tye Smith, the corner from Towson. In large part, the reason I say that is because this is a team that has a really good history of drafting defensive backs late and turning them into players. Cam Chancellor, Richard Sherman, hell, even you want to throw them in there, Byron Maxwell. This is a Seahawks team that has a certain philosophy in place in terms of the types of defensive backs they like, what skills they want them to bring, and how they want them to fit the system. So it's not necessarily of utmost importance for them to have to address corner early in a draft because they know the type of guys they want and that they can get them later. It's an impressive thing when you think about the Seahawks. The fact that guys like Chancellor and Sherman were both fifth-round picks. Byron Maxwell, I think, was a fifth or sixth-round pick, if I'm not mistaken. These were guys that were drafted late, but found a way to become contributors, good players. In the case of Chancellor and Sherman, great players at the NFL level. So while with other teams, I might question the fact that they didn't address corner as early as maybe they should have based off of the need. And again, defensively, that Legion of Boom secondary was a three-man operation with Chancellor, Sherman, and Thomas in 2014. And especially once you got past Byron Maxwell at corner, the Seahawks were really, really, really weak. But in this case, based off of their history and the type of guys that go after, Tye Smith makes a lot of sense in round 5. And I look at a guy like Obum Gwacham in round number 6 from Oregon State, the edge rusher. Here's a guy with explosive athleticism that you could bring him in. He doesn't necessarily have to play right away. You bring him alongside guys like Cassius Marsh, guys that could potentially serve as replacements long-term for somebody like Bruce Irvin, who's in a contract year himself. A guy like Gwacham is a guy you might not hear a lot from right away, but could eventually develop into Bruce Irvin's replacement or another weapon as an edge rusher for the Seahawks in that defense. The biggest thing I do question is the drafting of Frank Clark. I thought they drafted him way too high. And again, I just really question why you would feel the need to take somebody like that high. Now in terms of the fit, I think he does fit, and he fits at defensive end, which is more of a need than people might think. Even with guys like Bennett and Averill in the mix, they needed some edge rushing depth there, and Frank Clark does bring that. I just thought there were a lot better players on the board. On top of that, a lot better players available on the board at bigger positions of need. But overall, when you look at the Seahawks draft class, they found multiple impact players on the offensive side of the ball to help Russell Wilson. In terms of trading the first-round pick of Max Unger to go get Jimmy Graham, and then trading up to go get a guy like Tyler Lockett. I love what the Seahawks did there. I like that they addressed the offensive line multiple times in day number 3 to try and make up for the loss of James Carpenter via free agency, to bring in some young depth on that line, which was a bit of a weakness for the Seahawks in the early and middle stages of that 2014 season. One area that they struggled with was on the interior of that line, especially in pass protection. And when you look at the multiple picks, whether it's Poole, Glowinski, or Sokoli, one or two of those guys could develop into potential starters long-term for the Seahawks. I thought it was a solid draft for the Seahawks in terms of their approach, a combination of using draft pick currency to help your team in terms of the players you pick, and using that draft pick currency to help your team in terms of the players you trade for. So I'll probably give the Seahawks somewhere maybe a C+, a B-. If Frank Clark pans out, this draft will look even better for the Seattle Seahawks long.